Hey, happy Flag Day, everyone. I hope you have yours on display, whether that be inside or outside of your home or workplace. Speaking of the inside of a structure, today's webinar is going to compare how using HERS lines up with the IECC and the ERI path in today's residential construction industry. Along with our guests, Jim Myers and Elna, we're going to look at a recent multi-state study that used data from the RESNET registry. Then we'll talk about how to leverage this knowledge to support energy code adoption, compliance efforts, and support builders to meet the energy code and exceed energy efficiency program requirements. First, I want to introduce our guests. Jim is the Senior Associate Director of Buildings Energy Efficiency Program at the Southwest Energy Efficiency Partnership, also known as SWEEP. That's where he works on increasing energy efficiency in buildings. Jim Myers is responsible for leading the buildings programs, including adoption of newer energy codes and standards, going beyond code with green building programs, and collaborating with stakeholders to increase efficiency in the built environment. Prior to his current role, Jim was a regional manager for an insulation trade association where he educated the building industry on the benefits of more energy efficient building enclosures. He has also served as a technical director of a home energy rating provider. He has provided building efficiency training across numerous building industries. Jim actively participates in International Code Council committees, USGBC chapters, and is a board member of the Energy Efficiency Business Coalition, a nonprofit trade association that represents energy efficiency businesses. He earned his engineering degree from San Jose State University and is a lead green associate and certified green professional. We're also joined by first-time guest, Elna. Isaac has spent 15 years as both an engineer and energy policy analyst. Currently, he is the Senior Policy Manager at the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance with responsibilities that focus on the Building Energy Codes program. Prior to arriving at MEA, Isaac managed the Appliance Efficiency Standards and Building Energy Codes programs at the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership, where he was responsible for promoting the adoption and effective implementation of both of those policies through the development and dissemination of technical and policy-related information. He was actively involved in the stretch code in Massachusetts, and before that, Isaac worked as a policy advocate for the Michigan Environmental Council, where he promoted policies and reviewed permits with the aim of cleaning up the coal-fired power plants that dotted the region. And I can tell you as a resident of Illinois, I know those all too well. Now, you should also know this webinar is powered by NV Energy, and they want you to know about PowerShift. You can never save too much energy or money. That's why NV Energy has introduced PowerShift to help its residential and business customers conserve even more energy and save money on their power bills. PowerShift by NV Energy is also about providing you with excellent customer service. It's your one-stop shop to find all the energy-efficient products and services to help you boost your bottom line, along with convenient ways to manage your account. PowerShift Energy Advisors are dedicated to working side by side with business customers to discuss their needs and to find energy efficiency solutions that save money. Plus, their Business Solutions Center is the place to go to discuss your bill payments and account-related questions. For more information, please visit nvenergy.com/PowerShift. Now, during the course of our presentation today, you can submit questions for our guests. Simply use the questions box that's probably on the right side of your screen. I'll review those questions and pose them to both Jim and Isaac during the Q&A time set aside after their presentation. Jim, let's start with you.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone, and hope everyone is having a great day. I want to thank NV Energy. I cover the state of Nevada and 6 Southwest states with SWEEP, and in Nevada, the state is moving forward with the adoption of the 2015 IECC. And with the 2015 IECC, that's where the ERI pathway comes into the code. And so a HERS equivalent pathway comes into the code. And so Isaac's really taken the lead working with RESNET to dive into their registry of data to see what level of data they have and how valuable is that to understanding the construction practices for complying with the energy code via the ERI pathway, or even recognizing the levels of construction today. So I'm in the Southwest, Isaac is in the Midwest. Okay, so the question is, when we've been building homes and using the other pathways in the IECC, we really didn't have data to fall back on. They could comply via performance path. There was a table there. They could comply via a trade-off path, a res check, a UA trade-off, but we still didn't know what was in the buildings when they received their C of O. And so it really was an opinion. Where are we sitting? How do we know compliance? And then you'd have to spend a tremendous amount of time and effort to do compliance studies, which Isaac's been participating in a few of those over the years. So we don't know what we don't know. But now we have this opportunity with the ERI pathway to understand more of how residential homes line up with the code because of the opportunity to capture this data. So data by itself, is good, but if you can't view it, either in a clean table or in a graph, for me personally, I like to look at graphs. I like to look at something pictorial, and so I can see a trend, I can see a pattern, and that's the value that you'll see from data that I've received and data that Isaac has received. So the data I'm presenting is on Arizona, because that was the only data that I performed the study was in Arizona, and that was based on the score of the ERI. It wasn't the detailed data. Isaac's going to dive into detailed data that he received in another state, the state of Ohio. My next state, as I get that level of detail that Isaac has, I'll be looking at Nevada. And so I'll be making some comparisons of my findings in Arizona, and as I think, again, I don't have that data, it's my opinion, my assumptions of what I'll see in the state of Nevada, and I would imagine it's pretty consistent across the country too. So this one chart on the left I use all the time. It's the water level in Lake Mead, Hoover Dam, and it just pictorially it shows we're doing much better this year than we were last year and the year before. And so this information, when we're able to view it, we're able to again understand the data. I think we're able to understand better. So we're talking about this section, R406, the Energy Rating Index of the IECC. It is a score-based, and it also has some other requirements that are part of the energy code. So, but at a minimum, you have to hit this score, and then you have some other requirements. As you can see, these scores on the right side of the screen, they're all in the low 50s, and there's a couple mid-50s. With the 2018 IECC coming out in September, those scores have gone up by 5 to 6 points. So it'll look different in the 2018 IECC. The scores will be in the upper 50s and low 60s across all the different climate zones. Okay, so the data that I received, the ERI data, what you're seeing here is it's based on a zip code. It's the quantity, the number of ratings, and the average score. This is great data. It doesn't tell me the size, so I can't necessarily see that it was large homes that were qualifying or hitting these scores, or whether they were smaller homes, or whether they were two-story or single-story. That I don't see, but at least I can see the score because the code doesn't say it has to be single-story, two-story, and so forth. So this gives me an idea of the construction level of efficiency of these homes in this state. So when I apply it graphically, and so I took this data and I applied it into a graphics program, I created a different color for each score, ERI or HERS score. And so I'm able to then see that we have scores that are in the upper northeast eastern part of the state and the southwestern part of the state and so forth. This doesn't show all the detail. It doesn't show whether that's 100 homes up in the north, and it's not, or if it's 1,000 homes in the left, southwest, and that's not either. But it does give me a picture. It gives us an idea. When I dive in deeper into the Phoenix Valley, there's more zip codes. I have more data. I'm able to see the scores. And so in this example, what you're seeing is the Phoenix Valley down to Tucson. But it's interesting. I can then dive in and see that there are actually some areas that are exceeding the ERI scores in the code. Again, I'm not aware, because of the data that I have, if these homes are complying with other provisions of the code, but from a score perspective, they are. So what's interesting about this area, and I cover Arizona, so I'm aware, there's two codes in this area that we're looking at, this pink fuchsia color here. And so Queen Creek is on the 2012 energy code, and then Santan Valley, that's in the county of Pinal County, and they're on the 2006 energy code. So we know there's a difference. We know that these homes are being built at this level across different energy codes. We know trades are able to, and we also know trades are able to move between the metropolitan areas. When we step out and look a little further, and here I'm just looking at that 50 to 59. That's because those are where the scores of the ERI fit. There were other scores in this state that were down in the 20s. There were scores, a few scores that were higher in the 80s, and those were not the predominant level. It was right in the middle. So I wanted to see a picture here and see how many jurisdictions they crossed, how many different levels of codes were being enforced in those areas. Here, as we dive in, I'm able to see others that are sitting at these higher 50 range. Now, again, when I look at the 2018 code, as those scores are raised, there's less of a reach to get just to the ERI scores here in Arizona. Where do they fit? The majority of the homes in this state reside in that 60 to 64. The average HERS in the state of Arizona per RESNET is a 63. Nevada, it's a 62. And so it'll be interesting to see how the bubble map aligns when we have the Nevada data. And it was also interesting to see we had less and less number of buildings at the HERS 70 or larger. So it was 24,000 over 4 years, and here's how it looks in a table format. And you can see, again, the majority of homes reside in that one area of the state. And my assumptions are we'll be seeing the same thing in Nevada, where we'll see it in the Las Vegas area. Here, what I've done is I've applied a filter on top of this. And so the white area is a utility. There are 2 utilities in the Phoenix metro area that provide electricity. And so I just filtered where one of the utilities covered to see if there was a difference. And I really didn't see any difference. And so, again, not having that data, I'm going to, an opinion or assumption, recognize this is a larger metropolitan area, and there are trades and builders that build throughout that entire valley. And so there's probably some to that level. Isaac will be able to dive into some more cool data. And so sometimes you can get lucky. And so by being able to see that ERI, that average ERI score, that was my low-hanging fruit. That's where I was able to look at this data and understand the ERI, the scores that are in the HERS RESNET database, the registry. Are those affected by utilities? Are those affected by energy codes? can it tell me additional information on what we can do with municipalities to help them advance their codes if they're at a lower code but the scores are fairly low, and so forth. So this is great data, but going deeper, going beyond this service, the surface level, invaluable insight. So at this point, I'm going to pass it on to Isaac, and he's going to dive in and go further with the RESNET registry data.
Hey, Jim. Thanks. This is Isaac Elna. Can you hear me? I will assume you can. Yeah. This is Isaac Elna. I'm with the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. I'm the Senior Policy Manager. So the purpose of what I'm doing is to take what Jim has done, and take it a little bit further and go more into the components of the buildings. To establish the framework here, what we want to be able to say is, you know, during, for example, anybody who deals in code hearings or who is involved in state processes with code, you hear all the time that some people will suggest or advocate for certain improvements in the code. And others will say, you can't do this, or it hasn't been done, or it's too difficult, or it's too costly. But what we rarely ever get is an understanding of what actually is being built. Not what can it be built or how much it'll cost, but what is being built. What is the market itself saying at this moment of time? And this is what the RESNET registry gives you an unparalleled view for. So what we've done is to say we've taken every rated home that was done in Ohio between 2014 and 2016. And I want to emphasize this because this is 2014 and 2016. This is based on version 14 of REMRate, not version 15. So these scores reflect the old version. We found all of the single-family and/or duplex that were built during that period, and we found that there were about 10,000 homes in Ohio built during that period. And that is actually about a quarter of all homes that were permitted during those 3 years. And that's what makes this data so very rich and so very powerful, in that we get a very comprehensive view of what is being built. It is not just looking at about 50 homes and saying this is what the best home is. You're now looking at a quarter of them. And I will add that it's not just that it's 10,000 homes. It's not necessarily, and this data will show, it's not even the best 10,000 homes. It is simply the 10,354 homes that were rated. You will notice that the average size is 3,700 square feet. The Ohio code compliance, and this is important, is the 2009 IECC. That's the current code in Ohio during this period. Excuse me. And you'll notice that there is some changes in the number of homes that were rated, the percentage of homes that were rated against permits. It was very high in 2015. It was a little lower in 2016. It was much lower in 2014. That tends to jump around over the years. Also, I wanted to show that where the concentration of rated homes are. Of all the homes that were rated, 42% were in the Columbus metropolitan area, and another 20% were in the Cleveland metro area. So that is where the focus of the rated homes are. And so you do understand this is a major this is the major metropolitan areas in the state that more or less have almost 2/3 of the rated homes. So give you kind of a quick view of what the requirements are for the 2009, and I put these up here so that you have something to compare when we go into some of the details later. Foundation insulation R13, wall insulation R20, ceiling R38, windows U.35, air sealing 7, ACH 50, and high efficacy lighting 50%. These are the as I go forward, these will be the items or the requirements that we will look through as we look through the RESNET data. Now, when Mia worked with RESNET, what we asked is not just to send us the 10,000 HERS ratings, or excuse me, the HERS indices that apply to these 10,000 rated homes. We also, and they have this data, they could give us data on each of these homes as to these items. And it's much larger than these, but we wanted to keep it simple for the moment. So for each of the 10,354 homes, we have the wall insulation value, we have the ceilings, we have windows, air sealing, high efficacy lighting, air conditioning efficiency, furnace efficiency. So what you're going to see in the upcoming graphs is the distribution of how, for example, the wall installations. How many wall installations were R20? How many were R15? How many were R13? How many furnaces with an AFUE of 95 versus an AFUE of 92? And then you can see, based on this, how the rated homes stack up against the code, and how basically a quarter of the homes are getting built in the state of Ohio. So just to give what I want to kind of do to show is that, one, we wanted the slides will determine how homes are currently being built and how they can meet the ERI compliance pathway. We found that there were a lot of homes that were meeting a rating of 55. You'll see that in a couple minutes. How did they meet that? How did they accomplish that? That's a really important way of thinking about it, because that's what the point of the ERI is. The ERI gives you a lot of different ways of meeting the code. It also will tell us which are the energy code components that have the biggest impact on HERS scores. Where are they making the biggest bang? Where are they getting the biggest energy bang for their buck? And I'm going to compare homes with low HERS scores to see what you can do to give people a sense of what do you need to do to get to zero energy ready. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is that this data shows that we aren't as far from zero energy ready as we may think. So first of all, here's the HERS score breakdown. And the first thing that strikes you is that the average HERS score, and in fact the median HERS score, is around 59 or 60. So right away you can tell that for a quarter of the homes permitted in the state, you are very close. You are already doing extremely well in terms of energy efficiency in the state of Ohio. And I don't think many people would have guessed that or would have thought that. Keeping in mind that the ERI requirement is 55. And as you can see from this chart, even 55 or less is still about 3,000 homes. So already you can tell that builders are already, without really having this requirement in the books, are already building to this, and certainly can in large numbers. I wanted to go quickly over conditioned square footage, because that's always a big factor in terms of how a HERS index is viewed. So the first thing you'll notice that in Ohio, 85% of the homes are greater than 2,500 square feet, and about 27% of the homes are greater than 4,500 square feet. That's for the full set of rated homes. If you go for homes under 55, you will notice that now that number under 4,500 grows to 50%. So that's a big point that needs to be viewed, that as you're going lower, it's really being affected in terms of the homes are getting larger as the HERS rating, as the ratings are getting lower, as the HERS indices are getting lower. Above grade wall cavity insulation. And please note that the above grade wall cavity insulation code requirement is R20. There are some nuances to the Ohio code, but that is the code. And you'll notice that very few homes actually meet the R20 requirement. That the large majority of homes are R13 and R15. That will tell you that that builders are. That's your first indication that builders are using other code components to meet the overall code. They are not really doing this all that prescriptively. So that's your first clue here. Builders are really sticking to 2x4 construction, even though the code has asked them to do 2x6. It's requiring them to do 2x6. Even, I'll add, when you go to a HERS 55, still the number of homes R20 and above remain very low. So there is a widespread reluctance among builders to go to 2x6 construction for the most part, and that is something that you have to keep in mind as we're doing all our work. So this is a little tricky of a graph, but I also added, if you include continuous insulation, rigid insulation on the outside. What I want to emphasize here that this number, all of these, one, builders use all kinds of different ways to do this, but number two, the sum total of all of these is about 500. So really, only about 5% of the rated homes in the state use continuous insulation. It really, again, indicates that builders are hesitant, and this is something that we may always have to address, are really hesitant to use continuous insulation. And that doesn't change at all when you're going to HERS 55, as we noted before. One very, very key item that shows up in the RESNET data that we have to really pay attention to, and that is insulation quality. Insulation quality, for those who are familiar with RESNET and REMRE, has a fairly significant effect on the overall HERS score, outside of what the amount of insulation is. So it is so what a rater puts in as an insulation quality, whether insulation quality 1, 2, or 3, is very important. As a general rule, anecdotal evidence from the field tells you that insulation quality 1, which is the best quality, is a fairly rare phenomenon. This data tends to contradict that in a very, very obvious and striking way, as we were found that 98% of the insulation grades were a grade of 1. That tends to imply that something is a little off here. I want to emphasize that this presentation was given at RESNET back in February this year, and RESNET has taken note of this, and I believe they are beginning to take action on and address this issue. But do keep in mind that at the moment, at least in Ohio, and we believe in other states, there is a very high preponderance of raters giving an insulation grade of 1. And we're not sure that that's, in many cases, warranted. So this requires some action. Ceiling insulation. Again, this is another interesting one in the sense that R38 and R30 seem to be the big keys here. People are sticking to code or just slightly less than code. And even when you go to HERS less than 55, it still stays the same. R38 and R38 still is the preponderance, and less is the preponderance. So again, what you're noticing is that the levels of insulation that are being put in are fairly standard and even a little bit less than code in many cases in these rated homes, even for the ones that are meeting some fairly aggressive HERS index numbers. So within wall and ceiling insulation, that's a big key. Window U factor. The code says 0.35, and that one seems to have moved. The market has seemed to have moved a little bit more than on the insulation market. As you can see that about a third of the homes are already at 0.3, and over half of the homes are less than 0.32 U factors. So the fact here on window U factors, the market seems to have moved, and as many of us know, this was reflected in the 2000 IECC, which now requires a U factor of 0.3, which in the case of Ohio currently, and Ohio is still, like I said, on the 2009, about a third of the homes already meet that. So Windows has moved, and if you go to high efficiency windows, it's more or less the same. So it's not a factor of trying to get a low HERS numbers. This one seems to imply that the market as a whole has moved to more efficient windows. And now we get to what I think is the most interesting one, and that's air leakage. The air leakage requirement in Ohio is 7 ACH 50. And as you can tell, from all homes, from 10,000 homes, the average, or let me put it a different way, 93% of the homes were 4 ACH 50 or less, and 73% of the homes were 3 ACH 50 or less. In other words, the code says 7, and builders are building well below that as a regular basis. And this is the spot where I think a lot of the builders are making up their energy gains. They're finding that it is very cost effective to build tight homes, pretty airtight homes. And you'll notice that as I go to 55 or less, it just changes slightly. But basically at 55 or less, there is no home over 4 ACH 50, and the very large number of homes are 3 ACH 50, and the plurality, and that is 700 homes, are 2 ACH 50. So builders. This really tells us something very important, that builders know how to build airtight homes, that builders can build well below the 7 or even 5 ACH 50, which is a fairly standard code requirement. And this, I think, was what the biggest surprise I found in the data. Builders have already doing this, and they're doing this without any real code, without the code really pushing them to do this. They're doing this as standard operations. High efficacy lighting. Again, builders are the ones who are doing ratings are more or less putting all high efficacy lighting in, and you'll notice that between either all homes and homes that are less than 55, it doesn't change very much. The majority are 3/4 of them have 90% high efficacy lighting or greater. So that's another place where builders are gaining energy, are really making up energy savings. Cooling efficiency in Ohio, and this is going to be obviously very climate dependent. For all homes, more or less, it's R13. SEER 13, R13, SEER 13, with only a smattering for all other SEER values. But that doesn't change very much for HERS less than 55. That's still mostly a preponderance of SEER 13. So they're not really using AC to gain a lot of energy savings. This is SEER 13 is the federal standard. But in furnaces, and this matters in Ohio since it's a fairly cold place, you can see that you don't find anything under, more or less anything under AFUE 92 for all homes. And if you're trying to gain a good HERS index of under 55, you will notice that 95 and 96 become very, very preponderant. 2/3 of the homes are now 95 or greater in terms of meeting a HERS 55. So what you can start seeing is that if you're trying to meet a HERS index of 55, builder strategies seem to indicate 3 major items: furnace efficiency, high efficacy lighting, and air sealing. And those are the 3 where they really focus to meet low HERS scores. as this chart will indicate, this is just a way of saying, if I want to meet a HERS 55 or the code, the current 2015 code, how do I do it? And you can see that there's going to be a lot of different ways. But the big way that people do it is you go down at the air leakage row, and you'll note that all those air leakages, ACH 50 numbers, are very low. And the furnace numbers tend to be fairly high, and the high efficacy lighting numbers tend to be fairly high. With that said, you'll notice that wall insulation is got about an average of about 16 or even 15. Ceiling insulation is in the low 30s, and windows range from 30 to a high of 0.36. So insulation in windows, you need to get kind of basic code values or even slightly less, and they will make it up on high efficacy lighting, air leakage, and furnaces. So that ends my presentation. Happy to take questions along with Jim.
Yeah, and just like Isaac said, if you have questions, go ahead and submit them into the questions box on the right side of your screen. I guess I've got a couple, gentlemen, and since we just had Isaac on there and we've got his slides still up, I wanted to go ahead and start with Isaac. We're just talking about the high efficacy lighting requirement in Ohio. According to the 09, it was 50%. A lot of people were hitting mid-upper 90%. Can you talk a little bit about how big of an effect that has on a HERS score to have that, to have that high of a percentage of high efficacy lighting?
My understanding is that it'll affect about I'd say about 5 to 8% of your score. So you're probably looking on the range around 3 to 4 points on a HERS rating from when going from the code value to the 90% value. So I think that given that the incremental cost of going to high efficacy lighting is, I don't know, $50 in many cases, 50 to 75 bucks, you can gain a lot. That's a lot of points to gain on just going to more high efficacy lights. So it's a fairly significant one, and it's very. I mean, again, a lot of it ties to cost effectiveness in that you can gain 3 to 4 points for a minimal cost.
Right. And I think it's an incredibly important point to mention, is that I know that the builders and architects are looking for the optimal ROI to get the HERS score down, and how do you do that? And so that was kind of what was driving my questions, so I appreciate you hitting that point. Another one for you, Isaac. You showed overwhelmingly that the data is just so strong that 4 ACH 50 or less is being achieved. We talked in the intro about how can we take some of this data and leverage it into future energy efficiency discussions and possible legislation. Are there discussions in Ohio about lowering the ACH 50 from 7, down in future codes?
Yes, Ohio is in the process of updating their code, and they're not clear whether they want to move to the 2015 or the 2018. But yes, there are very specific discussions on what is, if you will, the most cost-effective way of increasing the energy efficiency of the code. And ACH 50 and air sealing is going to be a big way, because on the other side of that coin, as you've noticed, in Ohio, builders are still very, very resistant to building with other than 2x4 construction. And
right.
While that is not the case, I will add, in other states, and we have data from states like Minnesota and Iowa that show that builders can move into the 2x6 without any real trouble. In Ohio, there has been a lot of resistance to it. And so we have begun discussions with them on whether they would be willing to move on the ACH 50, and this data is part of the explanation of saying, you know, out of 10,000 homes, pretty much all of them need 4 ACH 50. So there's nothing that says there's your own data and your own construction practices effectively say that you can do this. But yeah, so we are in discussions with both the the code agencies and builders on how to move it, particularly.
And I know Oh, go ahead, Isaac. Sorry.
That's it, particularly through air sealing.
Okay, gotcha. I know I'm going to ask you to speculate here, but any ideas to why there's such resistance in Ohio specifically to move away from 2x4 or to try different methods of construction?
Well, I can speculate, but I've been involved in the Ohio stuff, in the Ohio code 2x4 discussion now for about 7 years. So
Wow.
I can tell you that there are the reasons that are given, which are valid, I will add, and there are reasons that are underlying reasons. The reasons that are given is reflect on this is the kind of construction they are used to. They will put in that there is a incremental cost and there is a cost to moving to 2x6 construction, both in terms of how you build with 2x6s and designing a home with 2x6 construction. 2x6 wall obviously gives you has some effect on floor area and how you have to design your homes. They've also said that we've talked with them over advanced framing techniques using 2x6 construction, and they have concerns about 2x6 construction in terms of issues of, this is getting real technical, but bowing out of top plates because you only use a single top plate as opposed to a double top plate. I know this is even, I didn't even think about this originally, but they mentioned that when you make cabinets and things, you build cabinets on a 16-inch in 16-inch modules because it's 2x4 at 16. If you build at 24 inches, as you're asked to by advanced framing, they don't have those kind of modules, and so they'd have to do a lot of redesigning. So those are a lot of the reasons they don't want to move to 2x6 construction. I think if there's any speculation, and I think this is pretty well known throughout the construction industry, is that in many ways, builders are an inherently conservative, I use that in the small c type of way, in terms of they don't want, if they have methods of construction that they're familiar with, they don't want to change them. Many of them work on a fairly tight margin, and changes bring in uncertainty, and uncertainty may bring in costs that they don't feel that they can absorb. And so they hesitate, and they strongly argue against going to 2x6 construction. In places like Minnesota or Iowa, those arguments are less important because the need for more insulation because of it being a much colder climate begins to overtake the discussion.
Gotcha.
So places like Minnesota have, all builders are usually using 2x6, but as the Ohio builders have pointed out to me, it's a lot colder in Minneapolis than it is in Columbus.
Right. You talked about some of the differences, and I think one of the other differences, help me out if I'm speaking incorrectly here, is window and door jams.
In terms of,
don't they get a little bit wider, a little bit thicker because you're dealing with a slightly wider wall?
yes, yes, yes. So that's a really good point. You are dealing with a slightly wider wall. I remember them giving me detailed cost estimates, and they had to include changes in trim and things of that nature. Trim costs were somewhat higher. And so, yes, the windows, how you install windows and doors becomes an issue for them.
Right, because now you gotta make a choice. Is the window set out? Does it set in? Does it set in the middle? Yeah.
And how do you build your trim so that it matches and it fits? I want to emphasize that none of these issues are insurmountable in any way. As I said, right. In places like Minnesota and Iowa, they've dealt with it and they've moved on. I mean, it's getting basically builders over the hump between 2x4 and 2x6. And, you know, in some places they have and in some places they haven't. But these are not insurmountable, but these are the reasons they worry.
And we're just addressing framing. We're not even talking about building systems.
Right.
You know?
Right. On the other hand, they don't have any problems, you know, as this shows, they don't really have a whole lot of trouble moving on to more efficient windows. And the market seems to be transforming right in front of our eyes on windows. They have no trouble at all moving to furnaces, and they know how to, you know, you will be hard pressed to find a non-condensing furnace in Ohio anywhere. And again, you can see that they'll be putting 95 AFUE ones where they can. So, if you move away from the insulation, which for some reason is where they draw the line, they are quite willing to move. And again, to emphasize this, their air sealing techniques, builders seem to be building tight homes as a matter of course. It's not even, this is not a, in our view, it's not that code driven. They're just building them because apparently the market is asking for it, and they can do it, and they can do it for little or no cost.
And I like it. I like what the data shows as well from the standpoint of, you know, you hear this myth that's thrown out there. Oh, the house is too tight, and you know, tight homes are not good. And it's like, oh man, you know, you get tired of hearing that regurgitated over and over because it's not accurate. And this data is showing that people are moving towards tighter homes that are better performing and healthier homes.
Yeah. And I'm not entirely sure they're aware that I'm not entirely sure that they're fully aware that they're doing it.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, that may not even know.
I think that, you know, there's the folks who are talking at the code hearings, talking about how what you're saying, and really the builders out in the field don't even listen and just building a tight home because, as you said, it's a better performing home.
Yeah, Isaac and I have been to a few code hearings before. Hey, I didn't want to neglect Jim here. So Jim, I've got a couple questions for you, and I certainly encourage the audience to send in any questions they may have. Jim, the wonderfully colored map that you showed us earlier, do you happen to know, are those largely production homes? Are they custom homes? Are they kind of a blend? Do you have any breakdown on that?
Yeah, that's where the level of detail from just looking at the ERI score doesn't provide that level of detail. I would imagine with the data that Isaac was able to discuss, you could distinguish. Although, correct me if I'm wrong, Isaac, all the data you received from the registry, it was there was no description of any builders or addresses or anything like that. Is that correct?
No, there was no description. No, we that was part of our agreement with RESNET. We don't want any addresses. We don't want any builders. Yep. We don't want any identifying information.
Right. So when we look at that ERI, when I was showing the map and different ERI scores, in my study, I was able to say, okay, if we have these levels of ERIs or HERS in this zip code, and this is the energy code, and in one case they were averaging 48, and there was a energy code at the 2006 level, then it's an opportunity to have the conversation with that jurisdiction and raise that energy code, because they're already at a higher level for all their other building codes, but they left their energy code to an older version. So unfortunately, we can't. So when I receive similar data as Isaac, I think the larger the buildings, the larger the homes, they tend to be custom, individual, one-off homes, not production. Unfortunately, I cannot, with the ERI, it's an average, know that it's just an average. And some of those slides that Isaac was showing, I know there's going to be on that bell curve, some to the left, some to the right, and there's that average. But when Isaac was talking about the heating and the increase in heating efficiency, so the 92% 92 AFUE, or it was the 95, 96 AFUE, I anticipate that I'll see a similar pattern in a hot climate of Las Vegas or a Phoenix or something like that, where I'll see the SEER go up for cooling as a trend. But until I get that data, it's still my opinion, and not the data.
Okay. Okay. I had one other question for you, and I'm going to make the last call to the audience to send any questions they may have. It's a little bit of a heady question. I don't know how technical we want to go with this, but how do you think the 2018 IECC, its solar provisions and the prescriptive requirements attached to that, how do you think all of that is going to affect scores in Arizona, a place where you're going to see more use of solar PV?
Yeah, with the 2018 code, if listeners are not aware, the 2018 code put some language in that said if solar is included in the calculation for the score for the ERI, then the building enclosure needed to meet the prescriptive requirements of the 2015 IECC. And so with that, then the building is still built fairly well. Efficiency is part of that building. And so the scores have raised, as I was mentioning, and as Isaac showed, I think we'll see more builders interested in the ERI pathway. They're already building, they're already getting more credit because they're building a tighter building. And I mean, they're going to hit those numbers in the 2018 IECC without solar. And then they can go beyond that. So as Isaac showed, the builders want to stay with the 13 in Iowa. That's a challenge for them to use solar then in Ohio, because it's a 13 when the value in the code of the 2015 is a 13 plus 5 or a 20. And so prescriptively trying to match that up, I think that'll be the challenge, is if they use solar. If they don't use solar, I think they're going to be able to hit those ERI scores fairly easily. As Isaac showed, they're there. They're basically there in Ohio. So in Arizona, when we go to Arizona, we have higher ACH requirements in climate zone 2, and there is a large interest in solar in that state. And so also in the 2015 energy code in Arizona, so in the Phoenix Valley, because it's a cooling dominated climate, the R values are not as great as they are in the cooling dominated climate, or excuse me, heating dominated climate, climate zone 5. So I think the builders will be able to hit, they're already hitting the 2012 and the 2015 energy code component requirements for insulation because they're not as high as the heating climate. So it's not a 49 requirement in the attic. It's not a 20 in the wall. It's a 13. So I think builders will be able to hit that 2015 requirement, and they'll get a little extra push from solar, but it's not going to be a lot of those of the score, I don't believe.
Well, you got to, I guess I should point out too, my question assumes that the 2018 IECC gets adopted in a place. You know, that's when the solar provision, the prescriptive requirements come into play. That we didn't see that in the 2015 either, so I wanted to make sure to point that out. So I have one final question for both of you. And Isaac, you mentioned this a little bit when you were talking about Ohio, and they're considering what code do they want to move to. In the areas that you both cover, you know, SWEEP is out west, MIA's in the Midwest and Upper Midwest. Are you seeing anywhere that's making a strong consideration, or even stronger than that, to moving to the 2018 IECC? I mean, is anybody moving to adopt it soon?
Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, I'll go first. In the Southwest, we see a lot of home rule. So the codes are adopted at the local level, the requirements. There's not a state requirement that's mandating a certain level of code, or even if there is. Nevada has a code level, but there's not a mandate that the municipality has to adopt it, so they can adopt a different level. And so we are seeing that jurisdictions are skipping a code cycle. And so we've had a number of jurisdictions that have gone to the 12 in the Southwest, and I'm anticipating their next step will be to the 2018 set of codes because they skipped 2015. And they don't want to get too far beyond the code where they can't continue to receive training and education and so forth. And so I do anticipate that at the local level that we'll see 2018 start to be discussed, and 2018 adoptions start next year.
Well, it affects their insurance rates too, so it's another thing they've got to be cognizant of. Isaac?
Yeah, in the Midwest, there was a little bit of a run towards the 2015 originally, and we have a couple of states that have already met that being Illinois and Michigan. There are a fair number of states who are fairly slow in moving the code, but there are a number of states that, as Jim mentioned, and there's far fewer home rule states in the Midwest that are beginning to consider the 2018 because they're skipping a cycle, or they didn't do anything on the 2015. They're on a 6-year cycle, and so they're kind of looking at the 2018. As I mentioned, Ohio has begun looking at the 2018, and they're still on the 09. Minnesota is also looking at the 2018. They're on a modified 2012, and Iowa's looking at the 2018 as well. And finally, Illinois, which has unlike the other states, a 3-year code cycle, and Illinois will be looking at the 2018 as well. The one difference between Illinois is that Illinois is at the 2015, so the changes that you would see in Illinois going to the 2018 are fairly minor, but it would have quite an effect both in places like in Ohio and Iowa and Minnesota. We think that particularly if the ERI values are maintained where they are, and as a counter to what Jim is saying, while there are strong efforts in a number of Midwest states to incentivize solar energy, the number of homes that we saw in the ratings, in the 10,000 ratings that included solar as part of their rating, were minimal. I think the number was something on the order of about 20 out of the 10,000 homes had solar as part of their rating. So obviously it is not as overriding a concern in the Midwest. But I'd say Iowa, Minnesota, and Ohio are states that are beginning to consider it, and states that should be kept an eye on.
Okay. Well, I see we're at the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I want to thank Jim and Isaac for sharing their time with us today and the results of their research and the progress that each of their respective geographic regions are making. And also want to thank our audience today. And finally, can't leave without thanking NV Energy for their generous sponsorship of this webinar. We're going to take a little break from webinars. Our next one isn't until August, so stay tuned to Green Building Media for more information on our next webinar. And finally, before we go, I want to extend a happy Father's Day to all those out there who are fathers. Father's Day is coming up this weekend in case you misplaced that on your calendar. Need to send a card quick. Until next time, have a great day and a wonderful summer. Take care.